So what do you think? So there are these different schools and approaches. Are there, I don't think they all get at consciousness work either, right? It's not all about developing that sense outside of what we think is self.
Yeah, I mean, Jung's work was really the only one of the major schools that started to go into the spiritual. I mean, there's the existential school, but that's a whole nother topic that I'd love to do an angry, arrogant rant about.
It sounds like the name's a little much. The existential school.
Yeah, and the existential school in general is a non-spiritual school. I just wanted to throw out there just to get back to it at some point. The existential school is sort of the most. It's this tricky thing because it's kind of like it. There's both sides to it. It kind of is saying that the ego mind or the intellect is. You would think that it's kind of this ultimate deconstruction of the intellect, but it in the process sort of magically resurrects the intellect as the ultimate purveyor of truth, because it comes back to every individual is allowed to and has the freedom to construct their own truth, and then the existential view is, and then that's the ultimate truth, because the ultimate truth is whatever each individual subjectively thinks is truth. So it sort of deconstructs the self all the way to the point where it reconstructs it as God. But simultaneously saying, but there is no God, and so you being your own God is fine.
I feel that's like what happens with most like disciplinary cases, that someone's about to learn something about themselves or about what, how they should go about their work, but then they're just, whoever's like in charge of that discipline just gets tired of it or moves on to something else. So the person just regresses back to what they were before. It's like quintessential postmodernism too.
Yeah, right.
You can fold it into a general postmodern rant podcast.
So this idea of consciousness, obviously the way I'm using the word, meaning a ontological thing versus a phenomenon, is that leap into the spiritual, right? There's a very big difference. Are we talking about a shift to something that is truly of a different nature, a different quality? Or are we just talking about a different organization of the physical world? And I'm definitely claiming a jump into something that's of a different nature, which is where you lose a lot of people. And it's where it gets scary or threatening to the ego. And it's where I struggle as far as my ego to still be very much, to still have lots of ego identification and attachment and insecurity and struggle, and then to simultaneously say, I have awakened in a certain way to a certain degree to where I have a certain amount, if you will, of conscious realization that is categorically different than all the machinations of the intellect. It's one of those things where unless you've experienced that to some degree, it just sounds so ridiculous and arrogant and delusional, and I totally get that. So it's a difficult thing to kind of try to. It's taken me a long time to sort of stand in that and say, kind of to come out as as awakened in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean that'll be like the challenge of talking about this at all is how do you share it in a way that makes people read Freud and not side like it's like we were talking about earlier, it's very easy to hear all that and like take the stance of Freud.
Right.
And I think that part of it is the work that you do with it, with other people, that makes it more about something outside yourself. Because like that's the distinguishing thing to me is that that work should lead us inward and then outward, and not just inward until it doesn't result in self-centered, ego trip, narcissistic bloviating.
Yeah.
Because so let's say you begin to awaken, and it's hard to, I think like how do you distinguish, would you say that if you begin to conflate that with yourself, like there's some part of it that is outside of ourself, right? So is the trap to conflate that fully with self?
Yeah, I think that's one way to, I think that's one of the traps.
Fair, yeah. One is a trap, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and that idea of differentiation, that there's, it always depends on what we're talking about. Like if you're going to walk to your car right now, as you're walking to your car, it's like, okay, self is your physical body, just meaning in the physical world. It's like, okay, self is your body. And so you got to navigate around the chair and around the table and, walk through the door, and you're orienting in space in a way that self is your physical body. And if you don't do it right, you're going to bang into stuff, right? But then once you get in your car and you start driving, now suddenly self is the boundaries of your car, as far as like how you're orienting your attention. And it doesn't matter where your knee is as far as on the road in relation to other cars. What matters is where are the parameters as far as the boundary of your car. And because you're trying to have your car not run into stuff. And so, we do this quite seamlessly, right? It's not like you got to sit and take 5 minutes to make the adjustment. I mean, you get in your car and you start moving, and boom, you shift your orientation to where now what you're tracking as far as quote unquote self, is your car. And so how we're contextualizing our awareness and what we're calling self versus not self at any given moment is highly variable. And we do it without really thinking about it. And a lot of the work that I do, and a lot of what the Dimension approach is about taking a look at that, because it's not always accurate. It's not always, we're not always going into the best attentional orientation to do a particular task, right? We find like the what I call performance work, that part of the work I do. I'm looking at what kind of activity is a person trying to perform, and then what are they doing with their attention? And one of the things is, what are they calling self? Right? How are they focusing their attention? And I'm always looking at orientation, anchoring, and identity. And the identity piece is, what are they calling self? as they're trying to perform this action, because it can vary. And if you're in a real nervous, anxious, insecure state, it's because what you're calling self, is basically the wrong thing to be calling self. How we feel, how we perform, what we're capable of is highly dependent on what we're calling self, where we're anchoring, and how we're orienting our attention.
I mean, that's huge. That's quite a claim.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that that's not looked at in its own right. It's just kind of taken for granted.
It makes me think there's like the fourth way schools talk about mini selves, and that we have all these different things vying for the driver's seat, and we're unaware of what's taking the wheel at any given time. But part of awakening is to begin to see those different selves, and then I think a transitional step is to like deputize one to be your default, driver.
Totally.
And I think it's a good metaphor for that. But it was really like, what you said was that, nervousness, insecurity, and anxiety stem from calling the wrong thing self.
That fourth way comparison, I mean, that's totally the same kind of thing. Gurdjieff actually stole that from me. I like that word, deputize.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, is that yours, or did Gurdjieff?
No, it's not mine. I don't even know if it's his. It's somebody from his school of thought. But I can't. It's one of those things where I can't remember if I read it or I heard it in a conversation. Then, as far as like the next step, obviously, like with consciousness, who is doing that deputizing?
Right.
There's something outside of all of it. And I think another good metaphor that you use a lot is acting, or is like character work almost, that our reactions fall into different categories, and like pick a different category or pick a different character to live through something or to filter something.
Yeah, and that gets back to the idea of archetypes and Jung's idea that there's these different characters that, like you say, we find ourselves identified with and acting or experiencing via, or a way that gets put as possessed by, which, and this is towards imaginal work, right? But that idea that people don't have ideas have people, which again is a game changer if you see it that way.
Yeah, it's very Buddhist. There's some quote like just about our thoughts, and that our thoughts are like the cause of all our misery. But
again, with the imaginal work idea, it was a big thing for me. I just a minute ago was talking about consciousness, and that if the way I have it divided up is consciousness work, imaginal work, subtle work, mental emotional work, physical work, performance work. The consciousness piece I was talking about a minute ago, as far as awakening, enlightenment, etc., and it being this very different thing than the mental or physical or emotional, that it's indeed a different realm and qualitatively different occurrence. Occurrence suggests phenomenal, but a different thing, so to speak. It's the same with the imaginal. The imaginal is different in that ideas having people, you could come from the mental part of that and say that they are thoughts, meaning concepts or these kind of inanimate algorithms or something. Whereas in the imaginal view, which Jung was in alignment with, they are spirits. They are these entities. They're not just these inanimate mathematical algorithms or something. They are organisms, entities, little beings, so to speak, and that's a radically different view. And obviously, that was the view in the past, up through the Middle Ages, and then the prevailing view, shifted, and anyone who had that view started getting burned at the stake. So it's a radically different thing. This idea that these ideas, that humans are possessed not just by ideas, but that the ideas are the ideas of an entity. And that's not only nonsense to most people today. It's one of those funny things. It's nonsense to them, and it's simultaneously terrifying to them, which is always, I think, is kind of funny. It's like, well, if it's nonsense, why is it so terrifying? But it's another huge game changer as far as what kind of world are we living in? What is self? What's the goal? What are we doing? What are we plagued by? And I've found myself talking about it a lot with people recently, because this idea of a virus, it's like, what is a virus? And is it a thought form that's spreading throughout the world, or is there an actual molecule? Right? Is there a molecule? Because we can't see it with our eyes. We just see a bunch of what we're told are manifestations of it, right? People get fevers and people, get all these physical symptoms, and then we're told that's indeed a result of this coronavirus that's running around the planet, trying to kill people and actually succeeding with a lot of people. And we accept that, we accept it even though we can't with our eyes see this thing. We accept that it's this organism, that it is seeking to propagate itself, that it feeds off of and lives off of humans, for example, and we're basically at war with it. It's like, yeah, well, we just kind of take that as, we accept that as a truth. But the idea that there are energetic, if you just make the distinction between physical and subtle energetic, the idea that there are subtle energetic organisms that are seeking to propagate themselves, that can use humans as hosts. We say, oh, well, that's ridiculous. That's a bunch of old world nonsense. It's like, well, how is it different?
It's a tough comparison. Like, I think it's valid, but I think it's a tough. I like the idea of, because you can be possessed by an idea. Like that's something that still gets used without thinking about the full meaning of it in that imaginal sense that you're talking about. That ideas themselves can drive us to do things, and that if we have these infectious diseases, we also have infectious ideas, and then those ideas, if they're harmful, have to be exorcised. But I think that's a topic for the imaginal ones, but I'm just making a note to come back to exorcism, because I think it's related to what you're talking about.
Yeah. It gets into real confusing territory, obviously, as far as what is a thought, what is a self, what is being. Is there such a thing as being versus just phenomena? Right? It gets right into that distinction, into ontology versus phenomenology. And you can't prove, nor even very satisfyingly talk about ontology using words, using concepts, because concepts are of the phenomenal realm. And so it gets real frustrating because you try to use phenomenal tools to point at ontology, but everyone just, if you can't directly experience the ontology, you're just left looking at the phenomena. And so it's like that idea of the finger pointing at the moon. Everyone's looking at the finger. It's kind of in vogue to talk about awakening and enlightenment and consciousness in that way. That it seems more and more that our society is accepting the idea of some kind of quote unquote spiritual consciousness that humans are capable of. But the idea of imaginal phenomena, beings, so to speak, entities, that's still very taboo.
Yeah, definitely. But it's tough. Like, I feel it's so hard to talk about. I've like had experiences working with you of this imaginal realm kind of thing, and it is bizarre and difficult to like describe to anyone. So I'm I can just imagine that you having to have tried to for so long has to have been really hard.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like for me, it like gets back to like that cult experience that you have when we talked about working on the subtle level, but it's also on the imaginal level that these possessive ideas are like an infectious disease. They're like a charismatic cult leader that like co-ops your being or your self.
No doubt.
And then like they have to be extracted.
Yeah.
And like redelineated between that idea or that possessed drive and self.
Yeah, and that's it's huge, obviously. And if you make these sweeping generalizations to history, it's like there were these various methods and techniques of doing just what you were saying, of extracting, exercising, etc., these ideas, these entities, these beings. And you had this shift to where, in that phase of history where there was burning at the stake, for example, during that phase, obviously, the witch idea, the sorcerer idea, the shaman idea, was not seen as nonsense yet. If it was nonsense, these people would not be burned at the stake, right? They wouldn't be seen as such a threat. So it's not like during the burning at the stake era, it was all seen as nonsense. It was seen as very, very real. And the view at the time was that the way we need to fight this, the way we need to keep ourselves safe from this, is that anyone who is infected needs to be done away with, which is very different than thinking it's all nonsense. Somewhere between then and now, it became nonsense. So it's just kind of I think an interesting aspect to this, that especially in our current, quarantine situation, this thing that's right under the surface right now in our society of how does this thing really work? How does it move from person to person? What measures need to be taken? And, how deadly is it really? And how communicable is it? And then based on that, for people who are unwilling to, take the suggested measures to not spread it, it's like how slippery of a slope is it to where those people need to be killed? So it's scary in that way, because I think my general sense, and I'm certainly not claiming to be in the know about the actual virus, but it seems like that's a bigger threat to society as a whole, meaning a regressive slide into, we need to kill all the people that aren't following the rules.
Or vice versa, but it's the same thinking, right? Like it's or like these people are imagining it and they should be dealt with.
Well, right, yeah.
But it's a similar, because I feel like there's just these any kind of divisive existential threat issue. You want to vilify anyone who responds to that threat differently than you, and then you make it about the economy.
I think you just took it political, Jeff.
Yeah, definitely. I'll edit that out.
Jeff said it, I didn't.
The opinions of Jeff Blanton are not reflective of the Dimension Approach. If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.